Good day, everybody. It's great to be back with you again with Hospitality Talks. Thanks for joining us. Today's topic is very appropriate in the environment that all of us are operating in. A culture conducive to innovation not only is good for the company's bottom line, but it is also something that both the leaders and the associates value in their organization. As a matter of fact, studies have indicated that the younger generation puts that as one of the most important elements when they join an organization to work with. Fixation on established paradigms and practices can severely limit the capability of an organization to change, and all of us have fallen prey to that. This common practice jeopardizes the ability of the organizations to keep up with the change in their environment. Couple this with today's customer journey that is more dynamic and unpredictable than ever, cultures and innovation becomes front and center. The operating environment presents us many challenges for all stakeholders. Our session today will focus on how we develop sustainable competitiveness through innovation and winning culture. I'm Abid Butt. Great to be here with you, and I'm here with my co-host, Sam-Erik Ruttmann. Sam.
Yes, Abid, it is a great discussion and so timely considering what we have been going through since last year and the leadership and team building and how to build the team even though they are not working physically in the same place. I think that takes a lot of effort in order for things to work out according to the expectations of the company and the customers and the employees themselves. So it's going to be very interesting to talk about this. But also innovation, which is a wonderful world, which is being spread out quite a bit easily with a light hand sometimes. And so it will be very exciting to talk about what actually innovation means and the hard work and sweat that goes through to real innovation. So if it's all right, let's bring in our guest to start the discussion.
Yes, please do so. Sam, I was looking up for culture and innovation, and two of the definitions that I like the best. Innovation was the introduction of something new. I'm sure there are hundreds of different definitions, and we'll ask our speakers for that. And culture was a manifestation of human intellectual achievement collectively. So I think for the sake of this conversation, we'll use those two definitions, or at least I will, and we'll ask our speakers to add to that. First and foremost, a career veteran, 26-year career veteran of Walt Disney Company. He's a leadership coach helping business executives provide exceptional leadership and build a strong culture for their teams. He's authored a book, How's the Culture in Your Kingdom? Welcome, Dan Cockerell.
Thanks, Abid. And Sam, thank you for having me today.
And secondly, Alasdair Trotter, who co-leads the innovation capabilities practice with Innosight, specializing strategies for organizations facing significant market changes. Hence the reason he is perfect for today's conversations, because our industry is going through heck of a lot of changes on all different fronts. Alasdair is a frequent speaker and has authored many articles on this subject of strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Alasdair, thanks for being with us and welcome to Hospitality Talks.
Thank you, Abid and Sam-Erik, and Dan, good to be with you all.
So if it's okay, Dan, if you don't mind leading us out with this discussion, we'll start with you. So tell us a little bit about your definition of leadership. The folks that you have dealt with, if we ask them, how would they define leadership?
Yeah, I would say there's probably as many definitions of leadership as there are people trying to describe it. And what I think the approach that I learned during my 26 years at Disney was it's about it's about actions. It's not philosophical. It's not a belief or a value system. Leadership really is about executing and bringing values to life through behaviors. So, if I was going to, talk to somebody about leadership, I think there's a few things to take into consideration. One is, going from starting parking cars as my first job at Disney to eventually running the Magic Kingdom with 12,000 employees. During that span of 26 years, over time, I slowly learned, and it became more evident to me that the leader in charge, it's not about you. As you move up in an organization, it's less and less about you, and it's more and more about the people who are working in your organization. Because the reality was at the Magic Kingdom, a place that's open, 15, 16 hours a day, and then has a whole operation during the night for maintenance and painting and getting ready for the next day, open 365 days a year during normal operations. One person can't be the differentiator. You really have to figure out how everyone in an organization matters, and they know they matter. And that's the job of a leader. It's not to do, it is to make sure it gets done. And a leader in an organization is the one who can set the tone regarding culture, because everyone looks to the leader to role model and takes their cues from that person. So every time I think to myself, I said, look, my job is not to be the best leader here at the Magic Kingdom. My job is to make sure we achieve our mission. And by doing that, I have to make sure we get the right people on the team with the right talents, the right attitude. I have to make sure I build strong relationships with them so they trust me and we can work together, because we're going to spend a lot of time together. I need to make sure I set clear expectations for performance. And that's something that a lot of companies and a lot of leaders don't pay attention to. They just assume through osmosis, people are going to figure out what the expectations are, but you have to create clarity for people and what you expect. And lastly, you need to reward and recognize performance when you see it, to reinforce it so it happens again. And you have to have the courage to coach and correct behavior that is not what your expectations are, to make sure you're continually improving. So, the concept's very easy to understand, very hard to execute. And that's, I think that's, as my wife so often says, it's simple, but not easy. And that's how we think about it. We try to break it down in its very basic components.
Well, Dan, thank you for that. And as you said, all of us have known about these things as to what a successful leader should be like. Yet there are several examples where we don't practice it because it is very hard, because of all the sort of contradictory forces that are upon a person who's trying to run the organization. When I was going to school and also in hospitality industry, Disney was sort of the gold standard that everybody used as an example in our service training programs. How did Disney get to that level? What was it that all of you were doing to have that very strong culture developed?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, and I know you mentioned defining culture. The way I like to define culture, I've done a lot of reading about this, and what I've landed on, culture is quote unquote how things are done around here. When you go to any person's house or a place of business or any social setting, there's a way that things are done. And that's what the culture is. It's accepted behaviors. So when I think about the Walt Disney Company being able to build a culture, once again, I'll go back to this formula. I think Disney has understood that if you want to have people who are going to excel in the hospitality industry, you need to hire people who enjoy service. And so this is one of the secrets of Disney. We kind of stack the deck. We hire people who are going to be successful in that culture. We don't hire people based on resume or based on their interview. We hire people that we see who are going to they enjoy service, they enjoy taking care of people. They have a great attitude, and they're wired to overcome obstacles. And there's a whole interview approach to this of selection. And I'll tell you, this is probably it is the most important thing in having your company be successful, is get the right people there. Because once you do that, everything else is icing on the cake. But when you get the right people into your company, great things happen. Because if you give them room to run, you empower them to make decisions and let them go and do what they do, they're going to bring excellent results to you. So first of all, get people in the organization that understand the culture and are going to fit in that culture. And we're very clear during the casting process. We show them a video and we talk to them about what it's like to work here. If you have trouble with ambiguity, hospitality is not a good place to work, because 1 minute you have a big queue line and your general manager's asking you why the wait time's so long, and an hour later they're going to ask you why you have so many employees at the front desk and how are you managing your labor. I mean, it's a business of ambiguity and changes. And something else is, we always ask our people, do you like to work on teams? If you don't like to work on teams, Disney and hospitality is probably not a good profession to work in. Do you enjoy making decisions independently? If that's the case, a big corporation is probably not a place you want to be, because decisions are not made independently. And so it's not about good or bad. It's just about how things operate and look for that right fit. And then the other big thing I just tell you is expectations. I'll come back to that. On the first day any employee is hired at Disney, they go through traditions. And traditions is basically a 2-day course on the history of Disney, how it came to be, and what its mission is, and what its common purpose is, which is creating incredible, magical memories for guests. And when everyone walks out of that 2 days of traditions, they know the 4 quality standards. The number 1 quality standard, safety. Everybody knows, even if they don't know how to do their job yet, they clearly know that they should never put themselves, their guests, or their fellow employees in an unsafe situation. Secondly is courtesy. Be nice to people. That's what Disney does, warm hospitality. Number 3 is the show. Walt Disney created these theme parks to give people a place to escape into a fantasy world. And so everything has to be part of the show. You shouldn't be texting while you're out on stage. You should have your name tag on. We're very clear about the show we want to create. And lastly, the number 4 key is efficiency. And typically, most companies lead with efficiency. And we purposely put it at the bottom of our list, because we know that people are going to be efficient. Because when you work in a high stress, high volume environment, you're always looking how to be more efficient. But we demand that people look at safety, courtesy, and show before they look at efficiency. So when you give your employees a framework, we don't give them a binder of, a 100-page binder of here's how to make each decision in each situation. We give them criteria, and we let them use their own critical thinking to make decisions based on the criteria we've given them. And that really allows people to be empowered and feel comfortable that they're making the right decision, because we're all playing off the same playbook. And even if you haven't worked for Disney for very long, you still are part of the team. The day you put that name tag on, you're expected to perform at a world-class level. And so those 2 things, select the right people and set really clear expectations for them to make decisions. There's a lot more to that, but I think those are keys. And that ties into training. You spend a lot of time and money recruiting people, but we don't spend a lot of time training them properly. We give them the keys and we tell them to figure it out. I just don't think that's a good way to run your business.
It's funny you bring up the attributes for people that work in hospitality. A lot of my friends used to joke around with me saying that you call this work, you work at the most beautiful resorts around the world, and you call that work. You shouldn't be paid for this. And I would tell them, look, by the end of the day, you are emotionally exhausted, because 1 minute you deal with a guest that is over the moon. He or she is very happy. And the next second, you're going to deal with somebody who is agitated about something. And then you deal with an associate that might not be happy. So it's not only just the physical side of things, emotionally, you're exhausted. Then in this era of virtually working, How can leaders keep their teams motivated? You talked about recruiting the right people, and yet again, it's easier said than done. A lot of organizations have used psychometric testing, and they do try to assimilate people to varying degrees of success. But now it's even harder because everybody is working remotely. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think the remote work factor now, in my opinion, you still need to do the same things you were doing before around leadership behaviors, but just better and more purposeful and with more intent. So if it's important to build a relationship with your team and make sure you're connected with them, make sure you kind of have a pulse on how they're doing, how they're feeling, what they need, and they hear from you constantly. Well, before, if you got that done at the water cooler or in the break room, or you'd stop by their office, well, remotely, you can't do that. And so you need to recreate that dynamic, that process. And there's lots of ways to do that. I've heard of leaders, they have their staff meeting every week, but they start off the first 10 minutes of their staff meeting saying, okay, let's all talk about how we're dealing with this, working from home. Let's vent a little bit. How are you doing with your kids? How are you doing with your spouses? How are you doing with just being in these closed quarters and getting work done? So you let people vent and kind of talk about the difficulties they're going through. Then there are leaders who have set up one-on-one meetings with each of their direct reports weekly. Hey, you know what? Every week I want to touch base for 15 minutes. We're not going to run into each other in the hallway, so I want to recreate that. So let me know what time's good for you. We'll hop on a Zoom call and just talk about how you're doing. We don't have to get into work. I just want to make sure I'm monitoring how you're doing, and let me know what I can be doing better for you so that you can be doing a better job. My daughter's working for a startup company, and they have a process called office hours, just like you had in college to go see a professor. So certain times of the week, everyone is asked to log on to a virtual meeting room and just work in that space, but have others be in front of others. And so if anyone has a question or wants to call them or pull them into a separate room to chat with them, they're all available. And you create that informal collaboration that happens often in physical environments. So I think, once again, you have to be very purposeful about the relationships you're maintaining. You have to make sure you're constantly reassessing expectations. A lot of companies say, well, we think it's better to work at work and not work from home, because it's more you get more done, it's more productive, people feel better about it. That may be true for some companies, but my opinion is I think companies just don't trust their people, and they just don't trust that they're going to get the work done because they can't see them and can't monitor them. And if that's the case, then I think the company has a problem. I think they have not set clear expectations of what they want their people to get done. Because if you have the right people on your team, you should not be monitoring whether they're doing their jobs or not. You should give them clear goals, give them the tools they need to get there, and check in with them at certain milestones and see if they're achieving what you expected them to be doing. The problem is a lot of leaders don't know what they expect. And so they just kind of default to, I want people nearby so I can talk to them and make sure they're getting their work done. The big one here is think about all the things you did at work previously that you're missing and try to recreate those virtually. And once again, you just have to be more planful about how you do that.
One more question, Dan, and I'll turn it over to Sam. Do you think there are generational differences between leaders? Obviously, the younger generation or millennials or Gen Xers, they're probably far more comfortable with digital world that we're living in than possibly the baby boomers are. Do you think they have adopted these technologies easier and they've been able to stay connected with their co-workers and their associates?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a stereotypical response to that. But look at the three of us. I mean, we're certainly not the Gen Ys or millennials, and we're here. Somehow we figured out how to get on this call and deliver this. So I think there is a certain generational piece to this, but I think individuals have to decide if they are going to live by that stereotype or they're going to step up and learn. And I've been away from Disney for 3 years now, and the amount of, I mean, I'm building things now that I never would have done before. When you're an entrepreneur, you learn a lot of things. And I think it's just your personal decision on whether you're going to have a growth mindset and you're willing to continue to learn. And I think some people just make an assumption at a certain age, you've mastered everything you can master and you just have to use what you have. But you can't afford to do that anymore. You have to be on the edge. You need to be asking and being out in front and learning how things are done. And every generation has something to learn as the world keeps changing. But I think writing it off to different generations not being able to do it is a little bit of a cop out. I think everyone can decide on their own if they want to learn and they want to be relevant.
Oh, fabulous. And quite candidly, technology has really facilitated and provided learning platforms that you can learn at your own pace, from education to just self-help type of stuff. There is so much available. And I've really consumed a lot of that. I'm a massive consumer of it, and it's been fabulous. Let me turn it over to Sam, and I'll be with you in a moment. Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, Dan, I really liked what you said about that. It really is not, the age doesn't matter. It's basically about that your heart is in the right place and you are open up to learn new things. And I tend to do that myself, so I took that to heart what you said. So it's a terrific comment. And we have few of the viewers here who are we on the same gray-haired generation. So I really encourage you to keep on learning and do new things, and don't be afraid to try out new things. It's okay to make a mistake, because that's where you learn from them. But what I have a question is that with your tremendous experience with Disney and so on, and there must have been times where you are putting a team together, or means those are the people that you have direct reports with. How do you surround yourself with the right people? And they're not necessarily the same personality as you are, but what do you look for when you are putting a team together, and maybe as a advice to a CEO or general manager?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And my wife and I, we talk to groups often about this. By nature, we're all wired with confirmation bias. We're drawn to people who are like us. It's more comfortable. We have more things in common. It's easier to find common ground. And the issue is if you get that comfortable doing that, you're not going to create innovation. I'm sure Alasdair is going to have a point of view on this, but you need to have people around you that think differently than you do, have different experiences than you do, have different backgrounds than you do. Because no matter how smart you are, you cannot have the same amount of experiences as the group of people reporting to you. And as I tell people, if you don't have people on your team, or if your team is not constantly surprising you with their questions or pointing out things that you did not know, you probably don't have a diverse enough team. If you find yourself putting out ideas and you're constantly getting a round of yeses, that's a problem. And if your teams aren't bringing you ideas that you never would have thought of, or you think are terrible ideas, or you think have high risk, then you probably don't have the right team. So there's a few ways to go after this. One is, we're big fans of, Myers-Briggs and Strength Finders as a very formal way to look at people's predictive talents, predictive ways they handle energy, they interact with each other, and then look at that from a team perspective and take everybody's strengths, the way they deal with things, and make sure you have everything covered. Do you have someone on your team that can think as a empathetic feeler and put themselves in other people's shoes? Do you have someone on the team that is really good at analytics and very objective and sort of an engineering approach to things? Do you have someone on your team who's a futurist and can really look out into the coming years and start to talk to you about what you should be thinking about? So you need all these points of views. And so one is make sure you're using the tools that are out there. And secondly, realize that you do have a bias and start interacting with people that you haven't traditionally interacted with. Start talking to people that have not been in your sphere of influence and pull them in, because they're going to give you so many points of view that you can't even imagine. And I'll give a quick example. For years, traditionally, the vice presidents of the Disney theme parks were operators. just like me. I grew up, parking cars, then I worked in food and beverage, and I did the very traditional progression. Well, at one point, we started to bring in industrial engineers and business development people. Not only did they have great analytical skills, but they had the right leadership traits to be able to lead teams and motivate and set clear expectations and have a presence. And when we started doing that, boy, I felt out of place because these people, my peers, started asking questions I hadn't asked for 20 years. I didn't even know we were supposed to ask that question. They were coming up with things that were totally blind to me. So that's really important. You have to know, first of all, know you have the bias, and then break through that and start meeting people that you just don't always understand because they're so different in how they think about things. Then you'll make some big breakthroughs.
How do you build a trusting relationship? And considering a team might be diverse, and there are certain people who will say, well, they will not trust you 100% at the beginning, but they will take their time. So there are different ways of how trust is developed. But what are your thoughts on just in general? How do you develop a trust? And then with a follow-up, in case the trust is broken, is it possible still to regain it after all that? So those are the just two-part question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Valerie and I, my wife and I, have talked about this a lot, and she's got a good friend who is a therapist, and she talked to her about this. And what we've concluded is you cannot create trust. You can create the right environment, the right behaviors, the right connections with people that are going to create an environment where trust might happen. And then they have to choose whether they're going to trust you or not. And there are times, because this was a big deal for me. I mean, trust, to have, say, the people you work most closely with don't trust you 100%. That's concerning. But the reality is everyone has had different life experiences. They've grown up in different family backgrounds. Maybe they've had leaders in the past that have impacted their trust, and that's now going to impact you. So as I've learned over time is I like to try to get to know people personally. What makes them tick? What are their strengths? How can I lead them individually to make sure that I can make them the most successful I can? Usually trust is built and eroded during times of stress and crisis, because that's the time when during the good times, it's easy to trust everybody because you're not pushed. But when it comes a time around a hurricane or a COVID-19 or layoffs, you really see how people perform and how they handle and how they respect people. So I think you just need to do all the things you can to build the right kind of culture, and you're going to have various levels of trust with your people depending on the chemistry you have with them, depending on your prior and their prior experiences. And also it's a cultural thing. I worked in France for 5 years, and in Europe, you don't just meet someone and they become your best friend and you know all about their life. That's just not how things are done. In the United States, you go to a restaurant, and within maybe 5 minutes of the server coming there, their mother's name, where they're from. And so it's once again, it's not better or worse. It's just different. And you have to understand the difference between individuals. But I think the number one thing is treat people as individuals. If you can connect with people on an individual level, that for me is probably the best way to create the best relationship possible. That is hard because leaders you have lack of time, and there's a lot of details getting to know people individually. And it's easier to treat everyone the same because then it's more efficient. But that's not how you create the right environments for people to thrive in.
Excellent, thank you. Then my final question before I give over to Abid is that the balancing the work-life balance. I just read something about some very famous bank that where employees the younger employees are complaining that 97 hours a week is a little bit too much for them, that they don't have time for any life. I don't know how your work was in with business, but I can remember the times where I was putting in my 96 hours because I want to prove to the management I would do anything I can I can excel, and that was the thing to do when I was in the early 20s. But I think there's also maybe a generation shift of that people are appreciating that life after work. So it's not only about work and excelling in your career, but what are your thoughts and maybe some suggestions and advice for people who are either themselves in a career situations that what should they do and what should the leader do to make sure they keep a balance for the employees also, that they are can remain successful in their work?
Sure. This is, I like to call this a dilemma. in life, there's problems and there's dilemmas. Problems have solutions. 1+1 is 2. Dilemmas can only be managed. There's never a solution. And usually the most important issues in our life are dilemmas. Leadership is a dilemma. Do I make the financial decision here, or do I make the personnel decision? It's never right. You try to make the best decision you can. So a couple of comments around balance. I think the first thing is you should never look to your company to create balance for you. You are always going to be in charge of your own balance in your own life. And so you have to decide what's important to you. I think about this as I call it 3 buckets. I have 3 things I've focused on for the past 25 years to measure my personal success: myself, my family, and my career. And so, am I taking care of my health, my sleep, my fitness, my diet, my stress, my organizational skills? Am I maintaining a relationship with my parents, my kids, my spouse? And am I getting my work done? And so every day you either do things to support those things or you don't. And so that's kind of my little internal scorecard. But certainly companies are going to have to figure out how to create more time for people to have personal time, because that eventually the company that can figure that out, that's going to become a competitive advantage for them. And I know Citibank, I just saw a headline this morning. They just said they told everyone, I think, chill out a little bit. And I'm not sure what that means, but they're doing some policies to help people get more balance. My son works for a biomed company. He got 4 weeks of paid vacation the day one. And I reminded him it took me 14 years at Disney to get that. So things have changed. But companies aren't going to slow down. They're not going to slow down their development. They're not going to slow down new projects because they want everyone to have more balance. So it's going to be something that companies are going to have to, let go a little bit. They're going to have to get the right talent, because people who are talented can get the work done and take care of their personal lives. And it's going to constantly be a dilemma. We're never going to get to a solution. But I agree with you. Our kids are part of that generation. They're saying, you know what, money's not the most important thing to me. And my wife and I, we just thought, let's get a job and make as much money as we can. We didn't ever think about balance. That wasn't a word we used. But as we get older, we realize how important it is now. So I think, first of all, hopefully you work for a company that helps you do that. If you can't get there, you need to change and go to another company. And you have a lot of responsibility on yourself to create that balance. A lot of people don't even take the vacation they've earned. That's a problem. That's a personal decision they're making, and the company's not going to force them. So it's coming from both sides.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dan. And over to you, Abid.
Thanks. Dan, one more question, and we'll bring our next guest in. Talk a little bit about the culture fit. Everybody talks about it. Is it more important to hire people with the right skills or people that fit the culture?
Yeah. So, it depends what industry you're in, but I'll tell you, most of the people we hire at Disney, we don't really care about the skills they have, because we're going to train them on how to do the jobs they're going to do. Now, if we're hiring an architect or we're hiring a finance manager, an accounting person, they have to have some training already and maybe some certifications. But a lot of the jobs we train for, we can train for skills. And we talk about this constantly, is when you hire, you look at skills, you look at passion, and you look at attitude. And skills is probably the least important for most jobs. Passion is relatively important, but attitude is the most important thing. If you hire for attitude, you're going to hire people who never give up. They find resources. Even if they don't have the resources, they don't have clarity, they create it for themselves. And if you think about the people who work for you that have the right attitude, imagine if your whole team was like that. And they just overcome things. They're always looking, they're positive, and they, like I said, they never give up. And I had people like that on my team who would come to me, not only with the work I asked them to do, but 3 or 4 other projects I didn't ask them to do. And those people, I will pay them as much as they want, and I'll keep them all day long, because those are the people that are going to create value for your organization.
Well, fantastic, Dan. Thank you so much. Please stay with us. We'll be back with you in a moment. At this point, I would like to bring up Alasdair Trotter with Innosight. Alasdair, thanks for taking the time.
Hey, good morning.
We'll get right into it. I defined how I would think of innovation. What's your definition in the folks that you deal with? if you were to ask them, what is the most common definition of innovation?
So my definition is not wildly different from yours, Abid. You, I think, said that it's something new, and I just add a qualifier to that, which is something new that has impact. I think all too often people think of the conception of an idea or something we should do, which is a little bit like invention, a new idea, a new concept. But to Dan's comment earlier about execution or action, you have to carry that idea, and it has to have some sort of impact on the world. And I think of that definition of innovation very much as an umbrella definition. So the reality of innovation, and something we should certainly get into more in this conversation, is that everybody has their own definition. Again, something Dan mentioned earlier. And in fact, the fact that everybody has their own interpretation of what innovation means is actually one of the root causes of why so many organizations struggle with taking action against innovation, because everybody hears what they want to hear, and then off they go to do innovation. And that can often lead to some interesting challenges.
So why is innovation so important? Why is it being talked about? Why is it getting so much ink? And how do organizations really approach it?
Gosh, there's a bit to unpack there. So let's start with why innovation is important. Innovation is a means to an end, right? No one cares about innovation for the sake of innovation. They care about typically some business performance objective. It might be additional revenue. It might be entering a new market. It might be taking cost out of your structure. It might be about more creativity. And there's various derivative ways of thinking about it. But ultimately, there's some goal in mind. And at any point in time, a leadership team is going to have a balanced set of business objectives they're striving towards. And there will be varying degrees of confidence around whether or not the organization has what it takes in the existing operating model, the capabilities, the technology, the business models, in order to achieve those business objectives. And so what tends to happen is that there will be some area of opportunity. We are lacking a capability. We are lacking, a customer, a market. And what we need is to go tackle this seemingly challenging problem. And to do that requires some degree of creativity to go and overcome some of the barriers. And that gets loosely described as we need innovation to go and achieve that goal. And at any point in time, an organization may have many of these goals: to enter new markets, to take cost out. And, some organizations will announce, an innovation imperative, or it's a pillar of our challenge for the year. Perhaps it's a part of the organizational DNA, and innovation is one of the values, like, the show at Disney. So I think that, these are the types of things that organizations tee up as their challenges. And then the trick is, well, once you've teed those up, how do you now go execute against that?
So innovation, though, just about every organization talks about it, and every organization embraces it. It is not the easiest thing in the world to do, as was leadership skills, particularly in well-established organizations. Innovation becomes a bigger challenge.
Yep.
This is how we've done things kicks in. Innovation typically is associated with startups and tech startups that are disruptors. Any thoughts on that? Why is it so difficult to embrace for established organizations?
So I'll go back to something Dan said, right? Culture is in some ways a huge source of inertia. And that is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? So when you talked to Dan earlier, you described the fact that there is a way that things are done here, and you want to hire people who thrive in that environment. In fact, you want to set up processes and governance and strategic objectives and incentives in order to reinforce the culture that has made you successful historically. However, as an organization then develops that culture, it actually locks in place a lot of the processes, the informal beliefs that people have about here's what it takes to be successful in this organization. And so when change happens in the marketplace, large organizations find it challenging to respond because everybody has been acclimatized or acculturated to act in certain ways. But what used to work no longer works. And so the leadership challenge or the dilemma is how do you simultaneously change the strategy, the operating model to transform an organization such that every person in that organization or those people in certain parts of the organization start acting in different ways. And that's not a dilemma for startups. Startups emerge in response to opportunities, and they have no baggage, whether it's the baggage of technical debt or legacy infrastructure, or simply the baggage of here's the way things are done around here. So they can establish from day one, the culture and operating model that fits essentially the patterns of that founding team and how they want to get stuff done. They have a new belief that's created about a problem in the marketplace, how to solve it, and they figure out through a process of discovery, here's what it takes to develop or deliver a product or service that addresses a new customer need. And then the organization starts to build around them and lock in place over time the culture that is successful. That is a wildly different challenge to build an organization and set it up to scale to deliver a new value proposition than it is to transform an existing organization replete with its existing and highly successful organizational model for how to deliver value when the world suddenly changes.
So a lot of the established organizations, and we can think of several, they need to evolve, they need to change because the world around us is evolving all too quickly. Consumers today are possibly the smartest population that you can possibly think of, yet organizations still try to put these initiatives together that are sort of one size fits all. What is your, from your point of view and your clients that you deal with and projects that you have worked on, what's your organization philosophy on innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a number of ways we could approach this. One way to approach this would be to say, and talk about the importance of building customer-centric organizations, because I think a lot of organizations fall into the trap based on some of the things we've just discussed, which is they know what they need to produce and all the processes are designed to produce that thing. And so leaders become managers and they focus on the processes that they have always focused on. Whereas what they really need to do is ground their purpose, their vision, and reorient processes or rebuild them entirely where appropriate to anchor and ground in what are the unmet needs of our consumers. However, another frame might be helpful for this conversation, which is that of, we'll call it point solutions versus system solutions. So very often when we go into organizations that have wrestled with an innovation challenge but have struggled to see the impact of their recent actions, it is because they have done a series of very logical and arguably necessary things. For example, they have set up an innovation team, or they have run a hackathon. Perhaps they have set up a dedicated innovation fund. Perhaps they have adjusted compensation mechanisms. Maybe they've hired someone who's done this before into a key position. All of those actions are really great, really helpful things to do for an organization that is wanting to get better at innovation. However, if taken as isolated steps without thought to the integrated underlying system that creates innovation, most of those sole initiatives are doomed to fail in predictable ways. A new leader arrives into a structure, but doesn't have the budget or the authority to act. Someone tries to get an idea funded for something new and innovative, but it's deemed to be a poor fit with strategy. Or perhaps an innovation team is established and generates a set of opportunities which are consistent with strategy, but the capital allocation or resource allocation process is woefully insufficient to handle the nature of small experimental investments in the right process. It's geared around NPV or different ways of framing how value is created. And so I guess our organizational philosophy at Innosight is you have to take a systems lens when thinking about how to strengthen the capabilities of an organization to become more innovative. You need to understand that there is an innovation system already in place. That's why the organization has been successful. And so the trick is to figure out where are the barriers or the enablers, and where are the set of interventions you might make at the system level in order to unleash the latent potential, which is already likely in the organization.
Fair enough. For leaders, and we talked a lot about cultures just now for Dan. How would we create a culture that embraces innovation? Because most of the time, the new entrants into the organization, they're welcomed, but yet our desire is that we assimilate them. So it's sort of like Star Trek's Borg. You will be assimilated or you will be tossed out. How do we embrace and develop an environment where people will feel comfortable enough to give you an opposing point of view or different ways of doing things? It's not necessarily right or wrong, but it's just a different way of accomplishing a task that is needed to be done. Any thoughts on that? And I'll turn it over to Sam after this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's, I'll start with Dan's idea of the dilemma, right? There's no solution to your question. There is only the management or leadership challenge for how to approach that problem and do the best you can in your organization. I think, the first step, I'll go back to a comment we started on, which is you have to define what you mean by innovation. Again, it's a means to an end. So are you after new growth? Are you after, the removal expenses? Or are you asking every employee in the firm to be just a little bit more customer centric with a strong belief that that will then lead to a better business outcome, which might be more revenue or higher customer satisfaction and so on? Once you've then defined that, I think the next challenge is to recognize that the answer to the previous question is likely not one type of innovation. And I think the dilemma many firms wrestle with is you want essentially two different types. And this is simplistic, but there is a type of innovation that you want to spur in your organization, which is appropriate for everybody to pursue. Perhaps it is better customer service. Perhaps it is more creative problem solving. And you want them to take an entrepreneurial mindset, we'll use that phrase, in order to apply their critical thinking skills to just make the work they do a little bit more efficient, a little bit more valuable to the customer and so on. And that's one type of innovation. And almost every organization could do with more of that and wants more of that. But there's another type of innovation, which is kind of which you don't want everybody in the organization to pursue, but you want a few people to pursue or a few divisions. And that's the type of innovation that people might call disruptive or transformative, which is, hey, we want you to reinvent what we do, build something that we've never done before, plant the seeds for things that could grow into entirely new opportunities, either to go on the offense as an organization or to protect against what, some changes that we might be seeing happening in the ecosystem. And so I might frame the leadership challenge of how do you create an environment in which you can simultaneously manage and set up the organization to be successful. So once you've defined what you mean, I think one of the really important things to do is to really make sure you communicate effectively and with clarity about what the vision that you as a leader have for the future environment and for the role that your organization is going to play in that environment. What we often find is that, you can see this in the hospitality space at the moment, but you can see it in newspapers 20 years ago. Dan's industry has been going through this for the last 10 years. There is a vision that looks distinctly different, but that vision doesn't mean you throw out the old. The business that exists today has to change and transform itself, and that's one type of transformation. But there's a second transformation, which is the entirely new. And so leaders have to clearly communicate that vision, set up the appropriate governance structures, make sure that everybody understands where you're going and why you're going there, so that you can get back to that place where, as Dan referred to, there's some autonomy for leaders operating in those different parts of the organization. And they're not waiting for instructions. They are empowered to take appropriate risks to manage those two transformations simultaneously, but typically they're going to be embedded in one and not both of those transformations, where the dual nature of that transformation is managed at the very top of the house.
So any particular industries, and quite candidly, I must confess, hospitality has not been the most innovative in the world. There have been a lot of disruptors that are just taking our lunch away from the sidelines, but we have not been the most innovative. My opinion, I'm sure a lot of my colleagues would disagree with it. And I joke around with this, so take it with a grain of salt. I've always said our biggest innovation initiative was a curved shower rod, which is unfortunately not saying very much. What types of industries have you seen that have been truly innovative? Fintech, for example, comes to mind, that has truly changed the financial world. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's any number, and they tend to come in waves, and then even within those waves, there's cycles, right? So you can take, a lot of what's happening in Silicon Valley and technology, and you see very rapid waves of change, whether it's, enterprise software, in which you've seen, huge amounts of change over the years. You look at consumer technology, you've seen a huge amount of change. You look at media, newspapers, music, and the evolution of organizations like Spotify or YouTube. What these have in common is there have been underlying developments in technology, but it's not the technology itself, it's the business model that's built around that technology that is the source of disruption or market transformation and opportunity. And so, there's a lot you can learn, I think, from those organizations. The change, what are the technologies that allow or are driving the underlying transformation of hospitality, but more importantly, what are the business models? How are people monetizing? What assets are being used to create value? What are the experiences that are being created? How do people think about business models, asset light versus asset heavy? And I think there's so much opportunity. People might look at the hospitality space and say we are getting toward the end of the first wave of massive disruption led by companies perhaps like Airbnb. But the existing hospitality industry outside of the shock that COVID-19 has caused is still a thriving, strong business that is likely, in fact, next year to see incredible growth as we get back to incredible, new people starting to travel again. However, structurally, I suspect it will have changed. I think as you think about customer needs, whether it's the business versus leisure segment or any other segmentation, older travelers versus millennial travelers versus, Gen Xers, right? I think the trick to unlocking the future wave of value will be in a deep, empathetic understanding of the different ways to think about who your customers are and what they're really trying to achieve. And then thinking carefully about what are the types of business models that are likely to emerge over the next 5-10 years that will best support what those customers are trying to get done in their lives. And then thoughtful management of the business you have today versus the businesses you might seed. And that will be the real challenges, those organizations that can carefully manage the challenge of bringing back the business that has been so successful online, while very carefully incubating, adjusting, and modifying the portfolio of potential new growth opportunities that the industry could face in the future.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll be back with you. Sam, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it just reminds me of what you were just saying, that there's something which is called the Sustainable Development Goals, like they call them global goals, and which is a collection of independent but interconnected goals, carefully designed that give all of us a possibility to this planet a better future. And many of the young professionals are really looking at the word sustainability as a big factor in their life and also in their workplace and what they're looking for. But my question to you, Alasdair, is that what is the most powerful way to enhance innovation when you look at the organization and when you're looking at the new client, for instance, and you give them the advice?
So what's the most powerful way to enhance innovation? Can you just clarify the question, Eric?
Well, meaning is that they are seen, the companies who are using the word innovation loosely as this could be the creativity could be used as part of the innovation. Some people call innovation a business model where you're actually pursuing to make changes, or even you are changing the rules. But when you're looking at without going into very specific, is there a way to enhance innovation and be very powerful when you are advising a client that what should be looking for when they want to truly innovate something which has never been done before in their business before?
Yeah, there's a number of ways I think to approach that. A couple that come to mind would be, I think, finding the why of the innovation. I always come back to as being really important. People find it hard to innovate without being given some form of constraints, right? We joke in our business that sometimes the worst challenge for an innovator is you've got a clean sheet of paper, right? Whatever you want. People thrive on constraints, and those constraints can come in many forms. So if you start with the vision, we just talked for a moment about the vision that leaders have for what the future of the industry looks like, and then more specifically what the future of the organization might look like, and the role you expect your organization to play within that future environment. I think organizations that sometimes struggle with that. They live with a backwards looking vision. This is the mission vision, the legacy. This is how we've been successful. There's essentially a formula for our success, and we need to execute against that. And it's all about operational excellence. I think those types of organizations thrive in the short term, and there is an appropriate point in time and in every macroeconomic cycle when operational excellence is the right thing to focus on. However, it's often those organizations that get caught flat-footed when there's market change. And so often the solution, the most powerful thing you can do there is to sort of rediscover the vision and then create a much more forward-looking, proactive point of view about the role you should play and the required change. And that can have a galvanizing effect on people if they understand the rationale for why they pursue. And you can ladder that down. So another thing we often do is work with organizations who are trying to say, we need to find the 3 or 4 areas where we think growth will occur. Now, sometimes the challenge is in, can you even come up with 3 or 4? Sometimes, and this is a better challenge, is there's so many choices for where the organization could go that the trick is focusing on the 3 or 4 that are not only most likely to yield new growth opportunities, but where the organization has the set of capabilities that mean that they are better suited than any competitor or startup, that they can go after those areas and create an unfair source of sustainable competitive advantage. But ultimately, I think if I bring it back to the simple idea here, it's harnessing constraints, finding focus, creating clarity that make people long for the sea rather than build boats.
Yeah. The obstacle for innovation, you mentioned there could be the people or organization, or maybe the focus. Are there some things that you could it be also the organizational culture that is not prepared for innovation? And then how would you advise the leadership for what kind of changes would they have to go? Maybe some tough changes if they really want to be the innovators in their industry.
Yeah, so I mean, we view culture as a lagging indicator of a number of other things. It is the sort of the tip of the iceberg, and underneath the water are areas related to strategy, governance, process, technology, and so on. So the question then is, how do you create a intentional, purposeful change in culture? And I think there's a couple of different lenses one can use in that. Firstly, we would recognize that's a systems challenge. So one path would be to work through all the elements at the bottom of the iceberg, get very clear per our previous discussion about the strategy, but then get very intentional about where you are going to make interventions, whether it's on behaviors or tweaks to process, changes to governance, adjustments to structure, in order to support the strategy that you have. And I think it does start from strategy, but I think you can design an intentional structure. In fact, our organization did some work in the banking space with Development Bank of Singapore, DBS, and then wrote about it in a recent book by two of my colleagues called Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And the key story they told there was of this organization, DBS, which they used to joke stood for damn bloody slow. But the CEO who took over that organization said, look, I want this organization to act like it's a 27,000 person startup. Now, we've certainly worked with bigger organizations, but anyone who's worked in an organization even that size will recognize there are still plenty of sources of cultural inertia and all the different places those can stem from. And they took this incredibly systematic approach to being very intentional about changing the culture. And it came down to a series of very targeted interventions that we call beans, behavioral enablers and nudges. And these are simple little approaches where you are really targeted on what is the behavior change we might want to go after. It could be something as simple as we have too many meetings where there are too many people present, or we have too many meetings which are wildly inefficient. Well, there's ways to overcome those obstacles. You have a rule around how many people there can be in a meeting, or you create roles. Every meeting must have a meeting leader and a joyful observer who makes sure that the meeting stays on track and provides feedback to the meeting leader. And those are just two, kind of fun little examples of, a portfolio of very specific interventions that were intentionally designed, rolled out over time. Those that worked were accelerated and scaled. Those that didn't were shut down. But over time, they created a very specific culture change that DBS was trying to achieve. And I think, any organization can take a leaf out of that book. It is quite possible to change culture, but it's not with one massive initiative. It's with very targeted, thoughtful interventions.
Very good. Okay, let me hand over back to Abid for the final questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Sam, if it's okay, let's bring Dan back in, but I'll continue with Alasdair for now. Alasdair, talk a little bit about some common threads with successes and failures in an organizations that are more innovative than the others.
I'll start with one with the goal of bringing Dan in here, and that would be customer centricity, customer obsession. I think is a helpful place. It's very common in organizations, and again, particularly those that are operationally excellent, or have made, and that happens either because they're seeing margin declines, or perhaps they have activist investors who believe there's a lot more opportunity on the table. But there's any number of reasons that might cause an organization to focus on. To Dan's point, if you have seasoned operators in charge, that's often a symptom of what happens when they take the reins. Is they know how to do this, they know how to operate, and so they are going to drive margin improvement for the business. Now, the downside sometimes, not in every organization, of an obsession on process, governance, efficiency, ROI, is you have a set of metrics that emerge, a set of processes, incentives start to align around these things over time. Then the culture follows suit to hire people who are really good. You've got a bunch of Lean Six Sigma experts in place. And all of a sudden, you look up 10 years later, you have seen that margin expansion, but now you realize revenue is stagnant. And so this is often when then let's have an innovation imperative that kicks in. And I'd say the symptom that's just emerges out of that story, but you see it in many other organizations, is they've just lost sight of the customer because they've so good at taking these processes, which started with, let's think about what the customer wants, but they've broken it down into there's only one person left in the company whose role it is to think about the customer. But everybody else now in the chain that delivers value is focused obsessively on their little bit of the process. And they are really good at that little bit of the process. But as a result, you have 95% of the people in the company who forgot why you exist. And if, God forbid, the customer need changes or the business model needs to change, everybody else in that value chain is left, cranking the wheel of the thing that is no longer working. And you've got, a small fraction of the organization shouting typically from the rooftops by this point that the customer doesn't need what we're offering, doesn't value what we're creating, and is seeing it emerge new sources of value elsewhere. And that, I'd say, is, the number one challenge organizations face. Dan, I don't know if that's something that you've seen.
Dan, any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I think listening to some of the comments you've made, customer centric, absolutely. If you're in your customer, they're receiving with their dollars. They're voting whether they're going to come back and whether they're going to recommend you. And so you need to constantly be talking to them and finding out what they need, what their new expectations are. At Walt Disney World, we found that people's expectations of having an app that could help manage their experience had become an expectation, not because that had developed in the theme park industry, because it had developed in their life. And they looked at us and said, why don't you have one? And we were forced, but also wanted to go there to retain them. So absolutely, I think what you're saying here, and I love the idea of what you're talking about. I hear you talking about is common purpose. Walt Disney World, every single employee's job is to make sure they create a magical experience for guests in their own way. And they got to figure out how to do that creatively, whether they're a housekeeper or they're a dancer or they're an attraction operator. And their job is secondary to that. And so they are constantly looking for ways to innovate because we've given them permission to find ways to create these magical moments for people. Yep. And then to your point, there's the more strategic decisions, the $1 billion My Magic Plus, that a cast member cannot make happen, but we go after that and find out, okay, what do people really want? They're telling us what they want. We're making improvements incrementally, but how do we transform the experience? And that takes,
the other one that occurs, Dan, is, so the question, right, is what is it that organizations sometimes see as shared challenges, right? So if number one is they're not customer centric, the other would be they focus on technology, and they are enamored of what the technology can do. And this is not unrelated to the first challenge, but it's a different spin on it, right? Which so I'll give an example. For a lot of the companies I work with right now come with a question, which is, gosh, what's blockchain or say machine learning going to do for our industry? That's particularly prevalent in, say, financial services, in more and more so in insure technology these days. But I imagine that's relevant for hospitality as well. And so organizations over-rotate to focus on what can the technology do for us. And there's incredibly creative people, often with engineering backgrounds or design backgrounds, product backgrounds. And if they're not careful, that focus on what can the technology do for us, that can lead to challenges, right? In organizations where the business model doesn't need to change and growth is happening, that's a great attitude. That's a great mindset, because the technology serves to further advance the organization to deliver against its common purpose. But if the industry is rapidly changing, sometimes you can over-focus on perpetuating a business model that is not actually future-proof. And so you see this a lot in the phrase digital transformation. A lot of organizations say, look, we're transforming, but what they're really doing is they're digitizing their existing analog business model. And that's great. That's part of sometimes the transformation to drive efficiency. But if that's all you do, all you're doing is potentially risking, perpetuating a failing business model into the future. And it's great. You now have a highly efficient and still not very valuable business model.
Fair enough. That's a great conversation. So, gentlemen, how do we go from but to yes and cultures and those conversations? Because most of the organizations live in but quadrant, and it takes inordinate amount of effort to go to yes and conversation. Any thoughts on that, Dan? I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, the organizations that we're working with now, we see that they're very successful. Their revenues are improving, their margins are improving, and they're choosing to look at innovation at the same time. Because when your company is successful, you can afford to take risks and you can afford to have failures. And a lot of companies, it's not intuitive. They wait until too late, as Alasdair mentioned, before they start to look at innovation. They don't have the cash flow. They're in a weak position. So the time to do that is when you're flush. That's when you should put in planting these seeds. Some are going to sprout and some are not going to sprout. But if you plant enough of them, it's going to set you up for the future. And you just need to have CEOs or executive leaders who are disciplined enough to be able to know how to execute today and know that what they're doing today is eventually going to become obsolete, and figure out what the next step is. And it's a hard thing to do.
Well, anything that we're doing, and quite candidly, technology has pushed the change in hyper speed terms. Things are changing all too fast. One more question before I turn it over to Sam, and it's for both of you. The different disciplines that exist in organizations, whether it's IT, HR, or finance, their roles in developing winning cultures and participating in innovation. When are they successfully participating in moving organizations forward versus holding them back? Alasdair, if you wouldn't mind taking the first question.
It's a good question. I think outside of things we've discussed already, like the common purpose, I'd say it's leadership alignment is often another area that creates real challenges. I think it's all too easy for the most senior leader in an organization to lay out a course, particularly with respect to where the future is heading. But there may be varying degrees of alignment across a leadership team, or understanding of exactly what that entails for their functions. And where we've seen organizations struggle with, whether it's a business unit or a function being, out of sync with others, it typically stems from misunderstandings and misalignments, or varying degrees of conviction within that leadership team about not just the importance or the value or the conviction with which they're acting on change. For example, it's very common to ask, and we do this frequently with leaders, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important or impactful is, trend X? And there will be lots of head nodding. Oh my gosh, that's a really important trend. Yes, that's an 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 for us. And then you say, okay, well, by 2025, will this trend have caused us to be 10% less revenue in our core business or 40% less revenue? And then you'll get the bimodal distribution with half the room saying, we're dead in 5 years if we don't do something. And the other half saying, well, it's really important, but not that important. We'll be fine. I've seen I've seen executives at very large companies have a discrepancy of over an order of magnitude, 10x, in terms of predicting revenues 8 years out into the future based on a couple of big trends, right? So you have these massive, but often papered over differences of opinion. And if you ask yourself then, well, what happens as they then talk to their teams, as they set goals, KPIs, as they manage, as they inspire their people, as they describe with the varying levels of conviction the purpose, it's not hard to see why, one office, office of the CFO might approach resource allocation wildly differently than a product team sitting in a different part of the organization. So I think it starts at the top of the house and then cascades downwards, getting really clear, really tactical about not just the vision, but the timing and the consequences for how we should think about investments, customer opportunities, and the day-to-day priorities.
Dan, anything you would like to add? The roles of these disciplines that exist in an organization? Because if the CFO does not allocate resources or HR doesn't support or does support, how would that impact the organization?
Yeah, I think Alasdair covered it. Alignment is such an important word. If everyone is aligned and understands the mission, they will line up behind that and figure out how they can contribute to push things forward. Often the expectations are not clear, and so people create their own agendas, and those agendas do not line up because they're done in silos. So that is, it is so important just to create a common, very understandable mission with clarity. And when everyone understands that, then they figure out how they participate in their own way with the resources they have.
So that's a difficult conversation.
Sam, over to you.
Leaders don't have sometimes, right? A lot of leaders spend time on day-to-day operations. There's regular scheduled meetings for, budgets and evaluations and project updates. It's actually rare to have a leadership team that spends time dwelling on some of these topics.
Absolutely.
Sam, you're muted, I think.
I was just saying that we have had a great discussion. I was just looking at the viewers' comment, but I don't see any particular question coming up. So if it's all right, David, maybe we can just, any last questions before we call it?
Yeah, quite kindly, we are running over, and it is a fabulous conversation, and certainly the time that we allocated is not long enough, and these gentlemen probably don't want to be with us any longer anyhow. But one last question. new disruptors that you see coming down the pike for hospitality? Dan, first you.
It is going to be what it's always been. People who understand the experiences people are looking for. And the disruptors who will be successful are going to be closely connected to the customers. They're going to be researching them. They're going to be talking to them. They're going to be making sure they're in sync, not only with what they're hearing, but what they think they want. That's another level of this. One of my favorite quotes is, if Henry Ford had asked everyone what they wanted, they would have told him a faster horse. So the idea is, I'm going to give you more of what you want, but I'm going to start to create emotional connections with you, and I'm going to create environments that you can thrive in with your family, you can thrive in and have these great experiences. And Abid, I think probably what you've mentioned is there's so much infrastructure in hospitality. That's where they get tied up. You can't just knock a hotel down and build a new one based on the new technology. So you have to constantly work with the infrastructure you have, but create the experiences that are going to resonate.
Terrific. Alasdair, any thoughts from you? Any new disruptors that you see coming down the pike?
So no new disruptors. Not that there aren't any, but I'm not an expert in the hospitality startup ecosystem, and so there's a better positioned folks to prognosticate there. But maybe the comment I'll offer would be, I don't necessarily think it's the disruptors as classically defined the organization, the industry necessarily needs to worry about. I think more and more what you see today is large organizations that have incredible customer access, right? Say the Googles or the Amazons of the world, the Facebooks, and an incredible underlying platform around data analytics, are finding ways to migrate across traditional industry boundaries. And so when I'm having conversations these days in fintech, insurance technology, healthcare, it's not the small startups that you necessarily need to worry about. In fact, the evolution of fintech over the past few years has been a gradual realization that these startups aren't the enemy. They need to partner with the large scaled institutions in order to be successful. And I suspect that same lesson may prove true for hospitality as well. So I would take a careful look, not just at the startups, but also what are these scaled institutions that already have acquired customers that can now simply offer leisure or hospitality related solutions to their existing customer base with minor adjustments to their business model that would create massive scale in very fast periods of time.
Gentlemen, a fabulous, fabulous conversation. Thank you for spending the time with us. Dan Cockerell with Cockerell Consulting Group and Alasdair Trotter with Innosight. Thank you for being with us. Your insights have been invaluable. Thanks for spending the time. Over to you, Sam.
Yes, I'd like to also thank all the live viewers and also the repeat viewer or replay viewers who will be joining us later on either YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook. We will have a video playing up on somewhere here. I was going to be coming here, so if you're on YouTube, you will see it on one of our other interviews. But also, this episode will be also on Hospitality Talks podcast. So you can, in your favorite, whether it's Apple Podcast or Google Play or Anchor FM, you will find us over there in the next couple of days. So take the time to listen to this great conversation, because I really appreciate both Dan Cockerell and Alasdair Trotter for their valuable input. And with this word, I just say thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.